across the country, the biggest in Boston.
The president also tweeting, "Our great country has been divided for decades. Sometimes you need protest in order to heal, and we will heal and be stronger than ever before."
A second police officer has died in the wake of an overnight shootout in Florida.
The threat to police officers has grown geometrically, where it's seemingly okay among some groups to dehumanize police and treat them as subhumans, which is totally unacceptable.
It is a fresh start for the White House with the departure of Steve Bannon.
Steve Bannon has the same ideological notion today that he did 2 days ago when he was inside the White House, which is he wants to change America for the better, and he has a new platform to do that.
The Powerball jackpot is now a cool $650 million. Woohoo! The chances of winning are about 1 in nearly 300 million.
You're probably thinking to yourself, huh? Who are these? What is going on? A lot of vacations in August, so a lot of people enjoying themselves. We're enjoying ourselves.
It's great to be here with you guys.
I didn't learn that until I moved to New York, but everybody in New York goes on vacation the last 2 weeks in August. It's just standard.
Yeah, the streets are empty.
Yeah. As empty as they're going to be in New York, yeah.
So if you're a tourist and you want to come to New York, this is a good time to do it because you can get into those, and see those things that you normally don't get to see.
Indeed.
We're going to bring in right now senior editor of Conservative Review and host of Michelle Malkin Investigates on CRTV, Michelle Malkin. Michelle, thank you so much for being here on a Sunday morning. And our first topic is the Boston event yesterday, let's call it that. Let's go through some of the specifics. When we were sitting here yesterday, it seemed like a lot of people were on edge, expecting basically Charlottesville Part 2. Protesters showed up, that's no doubt in that, by the thousands, 15,000 hitting the streets of Boston. The majority of them, though, were there to counter-protest the pre-planned rally in support of free speech. That original free speech rally, again, want to emphasize, this was free speech, this wasn't neo-Nazi, this wasn't KKK, this was free speech, but only a handful of those folks showed up. So President Trump, of course, tweeting, looks like many anti-police agitators in Boston, police are looking tough and smart. Thank you. He then also tweeted, "I want to applaud the many protesters in Boston who are speaking out against bigotry and hate. Our country will soon come together as one." A lot to unpack there. Michelle, have at it.
Well, first of all, I think that the behavior of many of those counter-protesters, which was on display, many of the local news stations there were able to show the true face of some of the more militant Antifa activists and agitators. These people were taunting at least one black officer and using the most vile language, proving, of course, that for so many of these so-called peaceful protests, it's not about standing up against bigotry. It's not about standing up against hate or racial supremacy. It is what it always has been with so many of these protests I've covered over the years, friends. It's about anti-police animus. It is about sabotaging law and order. You also saw many ugly and hateful faces and voices attacking the peaceful free speech ralliers who were draped in the American flag, or in one instance, an Israeli flag, who were harassed and bullied and run out of the park. This is not about peaceful protest.
One elderly woman holding an American flag, and one of these thugs grabs the flag out of her hand, knocks her down, and she tries to hold on to it.
Yeah, and you look at those free speech protesters, and you know, they were there with their guitars, dressed in rather hippie-like clothing. Right. They certainly seemed very peaceful. In contrast, you had that extremely organized effort with thousands and thousands of people that gathered at Roxbury College there in Boston, making that march down to the Boston Common. And you really saw quite a contrast there. At least, Michelle, in terms of the organization, walk us through what's really going on in terms of what the left is trying to do to mobilize.
Yes, Trish, this is part of the deliberate strategy of resistance. It was announced in the days after the election, and the well-funded left, funded by large billionaire philanthropists, right, like George Soros or the Borealis philanthropy, or many of the Tides Foundation. I mean, there are reporters in conservative media who have tracked and followed the money for decades now, really. We saw it pop up first with the anti-war protests during the Bush years. We saw it with the open borders lobby during the battle over amnesty. And we have seen it through the counter-protests to the truly peaceful Tea Party rally, and leading up through the Black Lives Matter, Occupy movement, and the agitation in the last years of the Obama administration. These are not spontaneous by any means. You see that in the way that their signs are so similar and so uniform, and you see the advertising for these full employment, full-time protesters. This is what they do for a living: obstruct, agitate, and harass.
Michelle, let's switch gears now to the statues. It seems like we started with the statue of Robert E. Lee. Now we're getting into other people. Take a look at, well, you can't see, but our viewers can. Look at all these statues that we raise the question. Are these folks heroes or villains? They include people like Teddy Roosevelt, Ben Franklin, of course, George Washington. I mean, where do we go from here? These protests, I mean, we saw what happened in the Christopher Columbus statue, just completely defaced. Where do we go from here?
Well, the anti-left whitewashers of history and rewriters of history will never be satisfied. They won't be satisfied until Washington, D.C. is renamed Obama City and Mount Rushmore is completely demolished. This all has its roots on college campuses, and we saw some of the movement of this in the last years, again, of the Obama administration. And now it has seeped into the mainstream. And you know, I've said for a long time, especially covering education issues, that the #1 problem with government education is they are not interested in confronting history and inculcating young generations of Americans with the facts. This is an extension of the safe space and bubble mentality of academic institutions, that they want to whitewash and eliminate any kind of political dissent on classrooms, and certainly we saw that with the explosions that happened at the Berkeley campus. But they would rather go the route of the Taliban or the Cultural Revolution under Mao and completely eradicate any kind of roots of the history and founding of our country,
Michelle,
warts and all, warts and all.
You know, it started with the Confederate soldier statues, okay? Mm-hmm. But now somehow we're talking about Christopher Columbus. We're talking about George Washington. We're talking about Ben Franklin. I mean, it doesn't even make any sense at this point. How does that start to change? I mean, what kind of dialogue do we really need to start having with the left so they don't actually tear apart our actual history as a nation?
Well, look, it means defending what our history is. And as I said, warts and all, there's no question that there have been many sins committed against many different factions and groups of people in this nation. But you confront that. You don't ignore it. You don't tear it down. That's what totalitarian and fascist countries do and governments do. And so really, I mean, I haven't heard a lot about this, but it goes back to elementary education. And we have a battle in those classrooms right now because the social justice warriors have hijacked federal education. It seeps down into the local classroom, and there has been a movement afoot, whether we're talking about the advanced placement tests, Common Core, the takeover of the College Board by social justice warriors. That's where it starts. And I think it means parents taking control as primary educational providers to teach their children history rather than hide history from them.
In the meantime, we have a Democratic state senator in Missouri, Maria Chapal-Nadal, who put on her official, her Facebook page the fact that she said President Trump would be assassinated. Now, she later deleted that post, said she didn't mean it, but that's what she put out there on Facebook for the entire world to see. Your thoughts, Michelle?
Well, sunlight is the best disinfectant, and I think that to the extent that social media has revealed the true thoughts and feelings and agenda of so many of these supposedly mainstream Democrats, it's very helpful. And I've been tracking the phenomenon of assassination chic for years now. I had an entire chapter in a book I wrote in 2006 called Unhinged, exposing liberals gone wild. Now, I do want to make clear, of course, that not every liberal thinks this way, not every Democrat thinks this way, but it is remarkable, especially in an atmosphere where we've got the politics of disavowal double standards. Disavow, disavow. President Trump and every Republican and every conservative pundit and public figure is always called upon to disavow every last fringe statement from random people across the country. Where's the Democratic official disavowal of this woman's death wish for President Trump?
And we've heard nothing from Tom Perez at the DNC. We did hear, I do have to be fair, we did hear from Claire McCaskill and the chair of the Democrat State Committee there in Missouri, but we've heard nothing on a national level so far.
In contrast, Michelle, what we've actually seen is a pile-on effect of sorts, not in terms of the assassination, but in terms of demonizing Donald Trump and all Republicans. You look at what Howard Dean said recently, effectively saying that if you vote for a Republican, you are voting for a racist in the White House. We saw similar kinds of language from the DNC, from Nancy Pelosi. These are, as I said earlier, perhaps the worst things that you can say about anyone, and they're throwing this language around with no sense of consequence, Michelle.
Yes, that's right. And I think that's what exasperates most decent people, whatever side of the political spectrum they're on. They're sick of it. I don't want to have to turn on the TV every morning and hear the hatred from rabid partisan extremists on both sides of the aisle. And I think this is exactly what President Trump was trying to get at last week. There were so many beltway chin pullers and all of the second guessers. And I'm sorry, but I was sick of Mitt Romney playing into this whole idea that somehow President Trump is a hater or on par with the worst elements in Charlottesville. He's not. We're not. So many times I have been smeared and likened to neo-Nazis and white supremacists. Look at me. Are you kidding me? and I think it's time. Yeah, really. I think it's time for people just to take a breath. And so I'm so glad that we've got this eclipse tomorrow, and then at least for a couple of seconds across the country for one moment in the morning, everybody's going to stop yelling at each other and look up.
With glasses on, though, Michelle. They got to be wearing the glasses if they look up.
That's one thing we can get behind.
That's true.
All right, Michelle Malkin,
good stuff, Michelle.
Good to see you.
Thank you.
You bet. Take care, guys.
He is no longer in the White House, but Steve Bannon says he is putting Republicans on notice. So what does that mean for the president's agenda? Bill Hemmer, today's guest host of Fox News Sunday, is going to join us.
And, of course, the left revealing its plan to bring back Barry and Joe to save our future.
Barry and Joe must constantly face their worst fears as the combined forces of Trump, its henchmen, and the Russians show up and fight them for control of the space-time continuum. This Kickstarter is to help us raise funds.
17 minutes past the top of the hour. Steve Bannon is leaving his post at the White House, but he's already taken on a new role, putting Republicans on notice.
In his first interview since his exit, Bannon telling the Washington Post, quote, if the Republican Party on Capitol Hill gets behind the president on his plans and not theirs, it will all be sweetness and light, be one big happy family.
That's the good side of things, right? So will Bannon actually be an asset for the president, even outside the White House? Joining us here to weigh in, we have co-anchor of America's Newsroom, Bill Hemmer, who's filling in for Chris today. Hey, I'm good. We got a lot of news.
I've been in the swamp all week, so you're going to have to forgive me here. And I heard you all talking about vacation. I'm not one of them yet, but that's coming up.
Soon.
Good Sunday, all
Good.
three of you.
Good.
You
You deserve
Bill.
it. So what do you think? I mean, Bannon now on the outside, he could stir things up, Bill.
He could, and I would expect him to do just that in conversations with a lot of people over the past weekend. My expectation is that Steve Bannon and Donald Trump are still in sync when it comes to the ideas and the issues going back to the campaign of last year. If anything, at least in the near term, I'm told that Bannon will fight for those same principles on behalf of the president. But the other folks in the West Wing, I would not be so sure about that. And I think that is something to watch as the storylines go forward in the weeks and months to come.
But what about him saying after he left the White House that the agenda of the Trump administration was essentially over?
Yeah, very interesting comment, John. You know, you saw those comments late on Friday night in the Weekly Standard. I thought that interview was very captivating. And the comment from the Washington Post overnight as well. It is my feeling that Steve Bannon believes that Republicans in Congress have not given this presidency a fair shake. I think also in that interview, John, when it comes to policies and issues and what you can and cannot get done, the only thing that he seemed to be positive about was a tax cut, a marginal tax cut, which he considered pretty standard for the Republican Party, but not this overall overarching tax reform that you're going to get. And if that's the reality, and frankly, we've been on the phone a lot over the weekend, and granted, it's the third week in August, and a lot of people are away, certainly here in Washington, a lot of people are on vacation. It wasn't easy to get a lot of folks to come on today to talk about this. And you're going to see this divide now. It's really going to be something that we need to watch after Labor Day between Republicans on the Hill and the White House.